A German shepherd blocked the train, refusing to move, no matter how loud the engine roared. The engineer hit the brakes, stormed out in frustration. But what happened next brought him to his knees in tears. Because the reason behind the dog's actions wasn't random. It was something deeply personal and far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. What was the dog trying to stop? And what did the engineer realize that changed his life forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Mark Halden's alarm cut through the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:30 a.m., just like every other morning. He opened his eyes to the familiar shadows of his small apartment, where the city's distant rumble filtered through thin walls. Without hitting snooze, he sat up and swung his legs over the side of his bed, his movements automatic after years of the same routine. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the bathroom. The apartment was small enough that he could cross it in just a few steps. A bedroom, a bathroom, and a combined kitchen-living area that he rarely used for anything, besides making coffee and storing his few possessions. In the harsh fluorescent light of his bathroom, Mark's reflection showed a man in his mid-30s with deep-set eyes and 3 days' worth of stubble. He went through his morning routine mechanically. Shower, shave, brush teeth, each action precise, practiced, purposeful. Back in his bedroom, Mark pulled his crisp navy uniform from the closet. The name tag read M. Halden in bold letters, and the fabric still held sharp creases from careful ironing. As he buttoned up his shirt, his eyes drifted to the only decoration on his otherwise bare walls. A framed photograph hanging slightly crooked near his bed. The photo showed 2 men standing on a mountain trail, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, wide grins on their faces. The younger version of Mark looked different, lighter somehow, his smile reaching his eyes. The other man wore a red hiking jacket and held up a water bottle in celebration. Mark quickly looked away, his fingers fumbling slightly with his last button. In the kitchen, he assembled his lunch with military precision: sandwich, apple, granola bar. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling his thermos with the strong black coffee he preferred. Outside his window, the city was still mostly dark, though hints of dawn had begun to paint the sky in shades of gray. The drive to the depot was quiet, with only a handful of other cars sharing the road. Mark pulled into his usual parking spot at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, just as he always was. The lot was still mostly empty, save for a few other early shift workers and the night crew heading home. Inside the dispatch office, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mark signed in. Linda, the morning dispatcher, looked up from her computer with surprise. "Morning, Mark. Change of plans today," she said, shuffling through some papers. "We need you on the Westbrook line." Mark frowned slightly. "The old freight route?" "Yeah, sorry for the last-minute switch. Johnson called in sick, and you're the only one certified for that line who's available." The Westbrook line was rarely used these days, a remnant of the area's industrial past that now mainly served as a backup route. It wound through the old factory district before cutting through dense woodland far from the usual busy corridors Mark typically worked. As he walked through the yard toward his assigned engine, Joey, one of the mechanics, called out to him. "Hey, Mark. Heard you got the ghost tunnel run today." Mark didn't break his stride or respond. Behind him, Joey chuckled, "Watch out for any spooky shadows in there." The morning air was heavy with moisture, promising rain later. Mark climbed into the cab of the locomotive with practiced ease, his boots finding familiar purchase on the metal steps. Inside, he began his pre-departure checks, moving through the sequence with meticulous attention to detail. Every gauge, every reading, every switch, nothing escaped his scrutiny. The radio crackled with the morning weather report. Light rain expected throughout the afternoon with increasing cloud cover and visibility remaining fair to moderate. Mark pulled out his phone and checked the radar, noting the green mass of light rain moving in from the west. He made a mental note to watch for decreased visibility later in the day, though it was nothing he hadn't handled countless times before. The engine rumbled to life beneath him, its powerful diesel motor sending familiar vibrations through the cab. Mark felt the subtle shift in his seat as the massive machine awakened, responding to his commands with the precision he'd come to expect over his years of service. As the train began to pull away from the yard, Mark caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The same serious expression he wore every day looked back at him, unchanged by the variation in his routine. "Just another trip," he muttered to himself, watching as the misty tracks disappeared behind him into the growing dawn. The gentle sway of the locomotive filled the cab as Mark guided it toward the less-traveled route, the familiar cityscape gradually giving way to the abandoned warehouses and overgrown lots of the old industrial district. Behind him, the tracks vanished into the morning mist, marking the beginning of what would prove to be anything but just another trip. Mark's hands rested steadily on the controls, his posture straight and alert despite the solitude of his position. The city's noise faded away, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails and the steady throb of the diesel engine. Ahead, the track stretched out into the misty morning, leading him toward the dense forest that lay beyond the city's forgotten industrial edges. The rain-heavy clouds continued to gather overhead as Mark guided the massive machine forward, the weather matching his quiet mood. His world had narrowed to the cab of the locomotive, the tracks ahead, and the steady stream of operational data he monitored with practiced ease. It was a familiar space, a comfortable isolation that he had grown accustomed to over the years. Just him, the machine, and the endless rails stretching out before him. The late morning sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the muddy ground beneath Benji Arlo's feet. His worn sneakers made soft, squishing sounds as he picked his way through the thin stretch of woods behind the foster home. The 11-year-old boy clutched a brown paper lunch bag in his small hands, holding it close to his chest like a treasure. The air still held the dampness from last night's drizzle, and the earthy smell of wet leaves and soil filled his nostrils. Benji's dark hair fell into his eyes as he navigated around puddles and overexposed tree roots. But he knew this path by heart. He'd walked it almost every day for the past 3 months, ever since he'd first spotted Ghost. Up ahead, the rusted chain-link fence came into view, its metal posts leaning at odd angles where the ground had shifted over the years. Next to it stood an old vending machine, its once bright colors now faded to ghostly pastels, its front panel long since shattered. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Moss grew in patches along its base, and ivy tendrils crept up one side. Benji approached the familiar spot and knelt down on the damp ground, not caring about the mud that would stain his jeans. He let out a soft, clear whistle. Not too loud, just enough to carry through the trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the subtle sound of movement in the underbrush. A large German shepherd emerged from between the trees, his movements careful and deliberate. Despite his impressive size, Ghost moved with a grace that made him seem almost weightless. His fur was mostly clean for a stray, though slightly matted in places, and his intelligent eyes fixed immediately on Benji. A smile spread across Benji's face, the kind of genuine smile that rarely appeared when he was back at the foster home. "Hey, Ghost," he said softly. "Missed you yesterday." His voice carried a hint of apology. "They wouldn't let us outside because of the rain." Ghost's tail began to wag as he approached, and Benji reached out slowly to scratch behind the dog's ears. The German shepherd leaned into the touch, and Benji felt the familiar warmth spread through his chest. Here, in this quiet corner of the woods with Ghost, he felt seen in a way he never did anywhere else. Benji opened the paper bag and pulled out his sandwich. He'd already torn it in half before leaving the house. One half for him, one half for Ghost. As the dog gently took his portion, Benji settled back against the old vending machine. "You wouldn't believe what happened at school today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ghost sat down beside him, chewing his sandwich half while keeping his eyes fixed on the boy. "Tommy Brooks broke my drawing pencil during art class. Just grabbed it right off my desk and snapped it in two." Benji took a small bite of his own sandwich, his eyes focused on the ground. "I tried to tell Mrs. Harrison, but she was busy helping Sarah with her project. She didn't even look up." He shrugged, trying to make it seem like it didn't matter, but his shoulders stayed hunched. "It was my last good pencil, too." Ghost finished his portion and moved closer, resting his head on Benji's knee. The boy's free hand automatically went to the dog's fur, finding comfort in its softness. "At least I got to finish my drawing first. It was pretty good. I drew the forest, with the old fence and everything. Even put you in it." As if understanding he was being talked about, Ghost's tail thumped against the ground. Then suddenly, the dog lifted his head and stood up, looking deeper into the woods. He took a few steps away from their usual spot, then turned back to look at Benji expectantly. Benji hesitated. He'd never followed Ghost into the forest before. Their meetings always stayed near the vending machine, close enough that he could still see the foster home through the trees. But something about the dog's demeanor sparked his curiosity. "You want me to come with you?" he asked, stuffing the remains of his sandwich back into the paper bag. Ghost wagged his tail once, then took a few more steps into the woods. Benji stood up, brushing off his jeans, and cautiously followed. The trees grew slightly denser here, but there was still enough space between them to walk comfortably. The ground sloped gently downward, and after about 50 feet, Benji saw something through the trees that made him stop in his tracks. It was a tunnel entrance, old and partially overgrown with vines, but unmistakable. The concrete around the opening was stained with age, and rusted metal tracks disappeared into its dark mouth. Benji had heard rumors about old railway tunnels in these woods, but he'd never seen one himself. Fascination drew him forward, but before he could get too close, Ghost let out a sharp bark. The dog quickly moved to block his path, standing firmly between Benji and the tunnel entrance. His tail had stopped wagging, and though he wasn't aggressive, his posture made it clear that he didn't want Benji going any closer. The boy couldn't help but laugh at his friend's protective behavior. Okay, I get it," he said, reaching down to pet Ghost's head. "No tunnel exploring today." The dog's tail resumed its gentle wagging as Benji turned back toward their usual spot. They had only taken a few steps when a strange sound stopped Benji in his tracks. A metallic creak came from beneath his feet, so subtle he might have imagined it. He took another tentative step forward. The ground suddenly gave way beneath him. Benji's scream pierced the quiet forest as he plummeted downward. The world became a blur from earth and sky, and then darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he saw was Ghost's alarmed face at the edge of what he now realized was a hidden maintenance shaft. Above ground, Ghost's frantic barking filled the air as he paced around the jagged hole, his tail stiff and alert. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the dark gap where Benji had disappeared, his barks growing more urgent with each passing moment. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce through the gathering clouds as Mark's train wound its way deeper into the wooded section of the route. The locomotive's rhythmic chugging echoed off the dense wall of trees that pressed ever closer to the tracks, creating a tunnel of green that seemed to swallow the train whole. Mark sat quietly in the engineer's cab, his experienced hands steady on the controls. The first drops of rain began to hit the windshield, creating tiny rivers that snaked their way down the glass. He reached up and activated the wipers, their steady swish-swish joining the mechanical symphony of the train. The radio crackled with static, making him frown. Reception had been spotty since they'd entered this stretch, but now it was deteriorating rapidly. He adjusted the volume, but it only produced more white noise. With a slight shake of his head, he turned it down to a low murmur. The trees pressed even closer now, their branches occasionally scraping against the side of the train. Mark had driven plenty of remote routes before, but something about this one felt different, more isolated, more wild. The rain intensified, drumming against the metal roof of the cab in a steady pattern. He checked his watch, right on schedule, despite the weather. The track ahead curved gently to the right, and Mark knew from his route briefing that the old tunnel would be coming up soon. The ghost tunnel, as that mechanic had called it. Mark allowed himself a small scoff at the memory. He'd been driving trains too long to put stock in ghost stories. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he caught sight of movement up ahead. Mark leaned forward, squinting through the gray curtain of rainfall. There, standing directly on the tracks, was a large dog. A German shepherd by the looks of it, its fur dark with rain. Mark reached for the horn, giving it a long blast. The sound echoed through the trees, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, it started barking, the sound barely audible over the train's noise, but clearly urgent. "Come on, move!" Mark muttered, sounding the horn again. Still no reaction. The dog remained planted firmly on the tracks, barking with increasing intensity. Cursing under his breath, Mark grabbed the brake lever and pulled hard. The wheels screamed against the wet rails as the emergency stop system engaged. The sudden deceleration sent a shudder through the entire train, and Mark had to brace himself against the control panel to keep from being thrown forward. Finally, the train ground to a complete halt about 50 yards from where the dog still stood. Mark's jaw clenched in frustration as he grabbed his rain jacket from the hook by the door. This delay would put him behind schedule, and he'd have to explain it in his report. He climbed down from the cab, the cold rain immediately soaking into his clothes despite the jacket. His boots splashed in puddles as he strode toward the dog, waving his arms. "Hey, get out of here!" The German shepherd watched his approach, its posture alert but not aggressive. As Mark got within 20 feet, the dog suddenly turned and bounded toward the tunnel entrance that loomed ahead. Its dark shape disappeared into the shadows, but Mark could still hear it barking, the sound echoing strangely off the tunnel walls. Mark was about to turn back to his train when he heard it, a sound that made him freeze mid-step. A high-pitched cry, faint but unmistakable, drifting out from the darkness of the tunnel. He stood perfectly still, listening intently through the patter of rain. There it was again, a voice, young and frightened, calling for help. Mark's heart began to pound as he stared into the tunnel's mouth. The dog's silhouette was barely visible now, a darker shape against the shadows, still barking insistently. He glanced back at his train, then at the tunnel again, his mind racing. Without a word, he turned and jogged back to the cab. His hands were steady as he grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from its mounting bracket. The weight of it felt reassuring in his grip as he headed back toward the tunnel. The dog's barking grew louder as he approached, echoing off the curved walls. Mark clicked on the flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the darkness. Taking a deep breath, he stepped past the tunnel's threshold and followed the German shepherd into the shadows. The transformation was immediate. The sound of rain became distant and hollow, and the air grew noticeably cooler. The beam of his flashlight illuminated old rails and crumbling concrete walls, everything coated in a film of moisture. The dog trotted ahead of him, its tail straight out behind it, pausing occasionally to make sure Mark was following. His footsteps echoed off the walls as he ventured deeper into the tunnel, fighting against the memory of another dark place, another time when he'd hesitated too long. The beam of his flashlight swept back and forth across the ground, searching for any sign of what might have prompted those cries for help. The dog's barking had changed now, shorter, sharper bursts as if trying to direct his attention. Mark swung the flashlight beam toward the sound, and his breath caught in his throat. There, about 30 feet ahead, was a ragged hole in the ground, its edges sharp and broken. The dog stood beside it, looking back at Mark expectantly. Another cry echoed up from the hole, clearer now. "Help! Is anybody there? Please!" Mark rushed forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He dropped to his knees beside the opening, careful to stay back from its crumbling edge. Pointing his flashlight down into the darkness, he called out, "Hello? Can you hear me?" "Yes." The voice was young, male, and terrified. "I'm down here. I fell." Mark shifted the flashlight beam, trying to see better. The hole appeared to be some kind of old maintenance shaft, probably forgotten when the tunnel was decommissioned. About 15 feet down, he could make out a small figure pressed against one wall. "Are you hurt?" Mark called down, already shrugging off his rain jacket. "My ankle. I think it's twisted, and I'm scared." The German shepherd whined softly beside Mark, its eyes fixed on the hole. Mark reached out absently to pat its wet fur, his mind already working through what needed to be done. "Don't worry," he called down, his voice firm and reassuring. "We're going to get you out of there. What's your name?" "Benji," came the shaky reply. "Please don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere, Benji," Mark promised, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. "Just hold on." The tunnel air hung heavy with moisture, each drop echoing as it struck ancient metal and concrete. Mark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of crumbling walls and rusted rails that stretched into the gloom ahead. The light caught floating particles of dust, making them dance like tiny stars in the beam. Ghost moved with purpose, his paws silent despite the scattered debris. Every few yards, the German shepherd would pause, turn his head back toward Mark, and wait until he was sure the man was following before continuing forward. His fur, still damp from the rain, seemed to absorb the weak light, making him appear like a moving shadow. Mark's footsteps crunched against loose gravel and fragments of old railroad ties. He kept his pace steady but cautious, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The beam of his flashlight swept back and forth across their path, revealing broken pieces of metal and concrete that had fallen from the ceiling over years of neglect. "Watch your step here," Mark muttered to himself, carefully stepping over a partially collapsed section of rail. The sound of his voice seemed muffled in the thick air, as if the tunnel itself was absorbing it. Water trickled down the walls in thin streams, creating dark stains on the aging concrete. Ghost suddenly stopped, his ears perking forward. He turned to Mark and gave a single, sharp bark that echoed off the tunnel walls. The dog moved to the side of the tracks, where a section of metal grating had given way, leaving a jagged hole in the ground. Mark approached carefully, keeping his flashlight beam trained on the opening. The broken edges of the grate stuck up like metal teeth, sharp and rusted. He could see where the ground had eroded beneath it, creating a cavity that had finally collapsed under Benji's weight. "Hello?" Mark called down into the shaft, directing his light into the darkness below. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." The boy's voice came back, shaky but clear. "I'm down here." Mark got down on his knees, being careful to stay back from the unstable edge. He adjusted his position until he could see into the shaft clearly. About 15 feet down, wedged in a narrow space between concrete walls, was a small figure pressed against one side. The boy's face was streaked with dirt and tears, and his left leg was bent at an awkward angle. "Are you Benji?" Mark asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. The boy nodded, wiping at his face with a grimy sleeve. How did you find me?" Mark glanced at Ghost, who sat alertly beside him. "You've got a good friend here. He wouldn't let my train pass until I followed him to you." He shifted the flashlight beam slightly, checking for any obvious injuries beyond the leg. "Can you tell me where it hurts, Benji?" "My ankle," Benji replied, his voice catching. "I think I twisted it when I fell, and my back hurts from hitting the wall." Mark nodded, already reaching for the emergency radio clipped to his belt. "Okay, Benji, I'm going to call for help. Just stay as still as you can, all right?" The boy's eyes widened in panic. "You're not leaving, are you?" "No," Mark assured him firmly. "I'm staying right here with you. I promise." He unclipped the radio and pressed the emergency channel button. Static crackled for a moment before clearing. "This is Engineer Halden on Freight 247, declaring an emergency situation. Over." A burst of static, then a response. "Copy, 247. What's your situation?" "Over. I've got a miner trapped in a maintenance shaft in the north tunnel of the old Millbrook line, approximately 15 feet down, injured but conscious, requesting immediate rescue response. Over." Mark rattled off the GPS coordinates from his phone, which thankfully still showed a weak signal. As he spoke with dispatch, Ghost moved closer to the shaft opening, lying down with his head on his paws, eyes fixed on Benji below. "Copy that. 247. Emergency services are being dispatched to your location. Maintain position and contact with the miner. Over." "Understood. Standing by. Over." Mark clipped the radio back to his belt, making sure it was still easily accessible. "They're coming to help?" Benji asked, his voice small in the darkness. "That's right," Mark confirmed. "They'll be here soon. Can you tell me how long you've been down there?" "I don't know. A while. I was following Ghost, and then the ground just..." Benji's voice cracked. "I should have listened when he tried to stop me earlier." Above them, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the tunnel, making the walls seem to vibrate slightly. Mark's flashlight beam caught more dust falling from the ceiling, dancing in the air before settling on the ground. A creaking sound echoed through the tunnel, metal groaning against metal somewhere in the darkness. Ghost's head came up, a low growl building in his throat as he stared into the shadows beyond Mark's light. Mark felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "It's just the old tunnel settling," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "These places make all kinds of noises." He shifted closer to the edge of the shaft, careful not to put too much weight near the broken section. Reaching down as far as he safely could, he extended his hand toward Benji. "Here," he said softly. "Take my hand." Benji stretched upward, his small fingers barely brushing against Mark's. It wasn't enough to pull him up. That would have to wait for the rescue team, but the physical contact seemed to calm the boy. "Don't worry," Mark said, holding firmly onto Benji's hand. "I'm not leaving." Ghost's growl had subsided, but he remained alert, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond them. The sound of rain grew louder, echoing from the tunnel entrance behind them. Another rumble of thunder rolled overhead, but Mark kept his focus on Benji, maintaining that crucial connection through their clasped hands. Water continued to drip steadily from the ceiling, and the old tunnel creaked and settled around them as they waited for help to arrive. But Mark's grip remained steady, his presence an anchor of calm in the darkness, while Ghost kept his silent vigil beside them. The radio at Mark's hip crackled with static before a clear voice cut through. "Rescue teams dispatched. ETA approximately 20 minutes. Over." Mark pressed the transmit button with his free hand, keeping his other hand firmly clasped with Benji's. "Copy that. Standing by. Over." Ghost's ears twitched at the sound, but the German Shepherd remained focused on the tunnel entrance, his posture alert and watchful. The rain outside had intensified, its steady drumming creating a hollow echo through the tunnel's length. 20 minutes isn't so long, Mark said, trying to keep his voice light despite the growing concern about the water he could see trickling down the tunnel walls. "That's about as long as a TV show, right?" Benji managed a small nod, though his hand trembled in Mark's grip. "I watch cartoons sometimes when the other kids aren't using the TV." A drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing on Benji's cheek. He flinched, and Mark instinctively shifted his position to better shield the boy from the increasing drips. "Tell me about Ghost," Mark said, hoping to distract Benji from their surroundings. "How did you two meet?" The boy's face brightened slightly at the mention of the dog. "He started coming around the foster home a few months ago. Nobody else really noticed him at first. He was really shy." Benji paused, wincing as he tried to adjust his position. "But he'd always come when I whistled. I shared my lunch with him." Mark nodded encouragingly while keeping one eye on the deteriorating condition of the tunnel ceiling. Water was now seeping through multiple cracks, creating dark streaks against the concrete. "He's a smart dog. Brave too. He's the one who led me to you." "Really?" Benji's eyes widened. "How?" "He stood right on the train tracks," Mark explained. "Wouldn't move no matter how much I honked the horn. Then when I got out to chase him away, he led me straight here." He glanced at Ghost, who remained steadfast at his post. Almost like he knew exactly what to do. A thin smile crossed Benji's dirty face. "He always knows things. Like when I'm sad, or when the other kids are being mean. He just understands." Water was beginning to pool in small puddles around the shaft opening. Mark shifted his position again, trying to keep his footing stable on the increasingly slick surface. "What happened today, Benji? How did you end up down here?" The boy's expression fell. "I was just following Ghost into the woods. I'd never gone that far before, but I wanted to see where he went sometimes." He swallowed hard. "He tried to stop me when I got close to the tunnel. He barked and got in my way, but I went around him anyway. Then the ground just disappeared." A sharp metallic groan interrupted their conversation, the sound reverberating through the tunnel. Ghost's head snapped up, a low growl building in his throat. Mark's flashlight beam darted to the ceiling, where water was now streaming through widening cracks in the concrete. The beam caught the glint of exposed rebar, where decades of moisture had eaten away at the tunnel's structure. "It's okay," Mark said, though he could hear the strain in his own voice. "The rescue team will be here soon. We just need to—" A deafening crack split the air. Mark's head jerked up just in time to see a support beam separate from the ceiling. Without thinking, he released Benji's hand and threw himself forward, covering as much of the shaft opening as he could with his body. The beam crashed down mere feet away, bringing with it a shower of concrete chunks and debris. The impact sent vibrations through the ground, and dust filled the air in a thick cloud. Mark coughed violently, his eyes stinging, but he maintained his protective position over the shaft. "Benji!" he called out between coughs. "Are you okay?" Yes, came the shaky reply from below. "What happened?" "Just some old ceiling coming down," Mark said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. He blinked through the settling dust, sweeping his flashlight beam around to assess the damage. The fallen beam had missed them, but it had taken out a section of wall nearby. The opening it left behind leaked even more water into the tunnel. Ghost's bark echoed sharply from the tunnel entrance, cutting through the sound of falling water and creaking metal. Mark turned his head toward the sound, squinting through the gloom. In the distance, He could make out the faint pulsing of red and blue lights reflecting off the wet tunnel walls. Relief flooded through him as he realized what it meant. "They're here, Benji," he called down. "The rescue team is here." The adrenaline that had kept him going suddenly drained away, and Mark slumped to the ground beside the shaft opening. His uniform was covered in dust and grime, and his muscles ached from maintaining his awkward position, but he immediately reached down to grasp Benji's hand again. "See?" he said, managing a tired smile. "I told you I wasn't leaving." Ghost's silhouette remained visible at the tunnel entrance, his tail now wagging slightly as the emergency lights grew brighter, signaling help's arrival at last. The tunnel echoed with urgent footsteps and voices as emergency responders flooded in, their flashlight beams cutting through the dusty air. The red and blue lights from outside created an otherworldly strobe effect against the wet walls, transforming the dark space into a hub of focused activity. Claire Juno led the first response team, her experienced eyes quickly taking in the scene: the collapsed beam, the precarious ceiling, and Mark's protective position over the maintenance shaft. She moved with practiced efficiency, her boots splashing through shallow puddles as she approached. "I'm Claire," she said, kneeling beside Mark. Her voice was calm, but carried natural authority. "Can you tell me what we're dealing with?" Mark's muscles protested as he shifted slightly, still maintaining his grip on Benji's hand. The boy's trapped about 8 feet down. His legs injured, but he's conscious and responsive. His voice was hoarse from the dust. Claire nodded, already pulling equipment from her medical bag. She leaned over the shaft opening, clicking on her own flashlight. "Hi there," she called down. "I'm Claire, and I'm here to help get you out. Can you tell me your name?" "Benji," came the tired reply from below. "Okay, Benji, you're doing great." Claire turned to signal her team. "We're going to need the rescue stretcher and pulley system, and get those supports in place first. This ceiling isn't stable." Firefighters were already setting up temporary bracing against the weakened sections of the tunnel. Others assembled a complex arrangement of ropes and pulleys, working with the practiced speed of professionals who had done this many times before. Claire gently touched Mark's shoulder. "We've got him now. You can let go." Mark hesitated for a moment, then slowly released Benji's hand. His fingers felt stiff from holding on so long. He backed away, watching as Claire and her team took over, their movements precise and coordinated. Ghost had moved closer to the shaft, whining softly as he watched the rescue operation. His fur was damp from the rain, but he remained focused on where Benji was trapped. "All right, Benji," Claire called down. "We're going to lower one of our team members down to you. They're going to secure you to a special stretcher that will help us lift you out safely. Just stay still and let them do all the work, okay?" "Okay," Benji answered, his voice small but steady. A firefighter in full gear was carefully lowered into the shaft. The radio on Claire's shoulder crackled with updates as the rescuer assessed Benji's condition and began the process of securing him for extraction. Mark stood back against the tunnel wall, his uniform caked with mud and concrete dust. He watched silently as the team worked, their voices professional and reassuring as they guided Benji through each step. Ghost stayed close to his side, as if sensing his need for company. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the rescue stretcher began its slow ascent from the shaft. Benji lay strapped securely in place, his face pale but calm. As soon as the stretcher cleared the opening, Claire moved in to begin her medical assessment. "Any pain in your neck or back?" she asked, her hands moving efficiently as she checked Benji's vital signs. "Just my leg," Benji replied, then tried to lift his head. "Where's Ghost?" The German shepherd's ears perked up at his name, and he moved forward, but Mark kept a gentle hold on his fur. Claire glanced up, noting the interaction. "He's right here," she assured Benji. "He's not going anywhere." The team carefully lifted the stretcher and began moving toward the tunnel entrance. Ghost immediately tried to follow, pulling against Mark's hold. A paramedic noticed and stepped forward to intercept the dog. "Sorry, boy," the paramedic said. "You'll have to stay here." Ghost whined, straining harder to follow as they carried Benji away. Mark tightened his grip on the dog's fur, speaking softly. "Easy there, big guy. Easy." Claire paused in her work to look back at them. Her eyes moved from Ghost to Mark, then back to the dog. "He's just trying to protect his kid," she said softly, understanding in her voice. Mark nodded, but didn't speak, his throat tight as he watched them load Benji into the waiting ambulance. Ghost had stopped pulling, but remained tense under his hand, tracking every movement with intense focus. The ambulance doors closed with a solid thunk that echoed through the tunnel mouth. Rain continued to fall steadily, creating a curtain of water between them and the emergency vehicles. Mark stood just inside the tunnel entrance, water dripping from his ruined uniform. Ghost sat quietly beside him, both of them watching as the ambulance pulled away, its sirens cutting through the sound of the rain. Claire approached them, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. She'd stayed behind to oversee the scene cleanup and final safety checks. Her boots squelched in the mud as she came to stand next to Mark. "You saved his life," she said simply, looking out at the road where the ambulance had disappeared. Mark shook his head slightly, drops of water falling from his hair. "No," he replied, his voice rough. "The dog did." He looked down at Ghost, who still sat alertly at his side. As if in response to the conversation, Ghost lifted his head and barked once, the sound sharp and clear in the rain-filled air. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Mark made his way down the hospital corridor, his work boots squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. The bag of clean clothes Claire had requested swung gently in his hand. She'd called an hour ago, saying Benji had asked for him. The boy wanted to make sure Ghost was okay. Mark had stopped at a discount store on the way, grabbing what he hoped were the right sizes. He'd never bought clothes for a kid before. The whole situation felt strange, like he was playing a part in someone else's life. The corridor stretched ahead, numbers on doors counting up. 8, 9, 10. His pace slowed as he approached room 12. Through the half-open door, he could see the blue glow of a muted TV playing some cartoon. He paused outside, suddenly unsure of himself. What was he supposed to say? He wasn't family, wasn't even really anything to the kid except the guy who happened to be there when he fell. But before he could second-guess himself further, a small voice called out from inside. "Hello?" Mark cleared his throat and stepped into the doorway. "Hey, kid." Benji was propped up in the hospital bed, his right leg elevated in a pristine white cast. Purple bruises dotted his arms, and a bandage covered a small cut on his forehead. But his face brightened immediately when he saw Mark, a smile spreading across his tired features. "You came," Benji said, sitting up straighter despite his injuries. Mark moved into the room, setting the bag down on a nearby chair. "Yeah, well, brought you some clean clothes." He gestured awkwardly at the bag. "Claire said you might need them." "Is Ghost okay?" Benji asked immediately, worry creeping into his voice. They wouldn't let him come in the ambulance. "He's fine," Mark assured him, pulling up a chair. "He's actually waiting in my truck right now. Wouldn't stay home when he saw me getting ready to leave." This wasn't strictly true. Mark hadn't even tried to leave the dog behind. Something about the way Ghost had watched him all evening told him it would have been pointless to try. "Really?" Benji's eyes lit up. "He's here." Mark nodded, settling into the chair. "Yeah, been pretty worried about you. Kept trying to follow the ambulance earlier." "He's a good dog," Benji said softly, picking at his blanket. "He always looks out for me. Brings me things sometimes, like sticks and old tennis balls. And he listens when I talk." Known him long? A few months. He just showed up one day when I was eating lunch by the old fence. I shared my sandwich with him, and he kept coming back. Benji's voice grew quieter. He's my best friend. Mark watched the boy's face, noting how he spoke about the dog with such certainty and affection. It reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place what. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and practical shoes that barely made a sound on the floor. "Time for your pain meds, Benji," she announced, moving to check his IV. Mark stood up, suddenly remembering something important. Has anyone contacted his family? To let them know what happened? The nurse's hand stilled for a moment. She glanced at Benji, then back to Mark, her expression softening with practiced sympathy. "There is no family," she said gently. "Benji's in foster care. No one's coming." The words landed like a physical weight in the room. Mark looked at Benji, who had turned his attention to the TV, his face carefully blank, in a way no kid's face should ever be. "I see," Mark said quietly, his throat tight. The nurse finished checking Benji's vitals and adjusting his medication. "Try to get some rest," she told him kindly, before leaving the room. Mark stood there awkwardly for a moment, then sat back down. "TV any good?" he asked, trying to break the heavy silence that had settled over them. "It's okay," Benji shrugged, still not looking at him. "They don't have many channels." "Well, maybe tomorrow I could bring you some books or something. If you want." This made Benji turn back to him, surprise evident on his face. "You're coming back?" "Sure," Mark said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Ghost would probably drag me here anyway. He's pretty stubborn when he wants something." A small smile crept back onto Benji's face. "Yeah, he is." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the cartoon on TV. Mark noticed Benji's eyes starting to droop, the pain medication taking effect. "I should let you get some sleep," Mark said, standing up. "But I'll be back tomorrow, okay?" Benji nodded sleepily. "Tell Ghost I miss him." "I will, kid. Get some rest." Mark walked quietly out of the room, closing the door partway behind him. He made his way through the maze of corridors and out into the cool night air. Ghost was exactly where he'd left him, sitting alertly in the passenger seat of his truck. When he saw Mark approaching, his tail started wagging. Mark didn't get in the truck right away. Instead, he leaned against the hood and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, something he hadn't done in months. His hands shook slightly as he lit one, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating his tired face. Above him, the hospital windows glowed like yellow squares against the dark sky. Somewhere up there, a kid with no one was falling asleep in an empty room. Ghost jumped down from the truck and sat beside him, pressing warmly against his leg. Mark took a long drag from his cigarette, then looked down at the dog. "No one's coming, huh?" he said quietly. Ghost lifted his head to look at him, then turned his gaze back to the hospital entrance, as if keeping watch. His posture was alert but peaceful, like he knew exactly where he needed to be. The autumn sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Mark's truck pulled up to the address he'd gotten from the hospital. The foster home sat at the end of a quiet street, a 3-story Victorian that might have once been grand, but now showed its age in peeling paint and sagging gutters. The front yard was neat enough, but sparse, just patchy grass and a single maple tree dropping brown leaves onto the concrete path. Mark sat in his truck for a moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Ghost watched him from the passenger seat, head tilted slightly as if asking what they were waiting for. The conductor's cap Mark had brought from home sat on the dashboard, along with a carefully wrapped sandwich he'd made that morning. "Right," he muttered, more to himself than to Ghost. He grabbed the items and stepped out of the truck, Ghost following close behind. The wooden steps creaked under his feet as he approached the front door. A small brass plaque read, Evergreen Youth Home in faded letters. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing a thin woman in her 50s wearing sensible shoes and a cardigan that had seen better days. "Mr. Halden?" she asked, consulting a clipboard. "I'm Mrs. Peters, the caseworker. We spoke on the phone about Benji." Mark nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt in his work clothes. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to check about the discharge process. Make sure everything's set for when he comes home. When he comes back," he corrected himself quickly. Mrs. Peters gave him a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Please come in." She glanced at Ghost, who sat perfectly still beside Mark. "The dog will need to stay outside." The interior of the house matched its exterior, functional but joyless. The walls were an institutional shade of beige, decorated with generic motivational posters that had curled slightly at the corners. In the living room, 3 kids sat on a worn couch, watching cartoons, none of them looking particularly engaged. A teenager dozed in an armchair, headphones firmly in place. Mrs. Peters led Mark to a small office just off the entrance hall. The desk was piled with manila folders and forms in triplicate. She settled behind it, gesturing for Mark to take one of the 2 plastic chairs facing her. "We appreciate your concern for Benji," she began, shuffling through some papers. "It's not often we see follow-up from Good Samaritans. However, I should inform you that this placement is temporary. We're actually looking to transfer Benji to a more permanent facility in the next few weeks." Mark's hands tightened slightly on the armrests. "Transfer? Why?" "It's standard procedure," Mrs. Peters explained, her tone professional but distant. "This is a short-term home. We try to place children in more stable, long-term environments when possible. There's an opening coming up at Riverside Home, about 40 miles north of here." "40 miles?" Mark repeated, thinking of Ghost waiting outside, of the old tunnel where he'd found Benji. "Does he know?" "We haven't discussed it with him yet. It's best not to create anxiety about changes until they're confirmed." She pulled out another form. "Now, about the discharge. The hospital says he can return tomorrow afternoon. We'll have someone pick him up." "I can do it," Mark interrupted. "If that's allowed. I'm off work and I've got a truck. Plenty of room for the wheelchair they said he'll need at first." Mrs. Peters studied him for a moment, then made a note on her form. "That would be helpful, actually. Our staff is rather stretched thin this week." She glanced at the clock. "Benji should be in his room if you'd like to see him. Up the stairs, second door on the right. Please keep it brief. Dinner's in an hour." Mark stood up, still holding the cap and sandwich. The stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed to the second floor. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors painted a dull green. From behind them came the muffled sounds of music, voices, a video game. He found the second door on the right partially open. Inside, 2 twin beds occupied opposite walls. One was clearly unused, its blanket pulled tight with military precision. The other was rumpled, and on it sat Benji, hunched over what looked like a cheap spiral notebook. Mark knocked softly on the doorframe. Benji looked up, his face brightening instantly. "Mark, you came!" "Said I would, didn't I?" Mark stepped into the room, taking in the sparse decorations. A few drawings were taped to the wall by Benji's bed, mostly animals, done in pencil with surprising skill. One showed Ghost, sitting alert with his ears perked forward. "These are pretty good," Mark said, gesturing to the drawings. Benji ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "Thanks. I like drawing animals best. They're easier than people." He held up the notebook he'd been working on, showing another sketch of Ghost, this one catching the dog mid-run. Mark pulled a folded chair from against the wall and sat down, holding out the conductor's cap. "Brought you something. From work." Benji took the cap carefully, as if it might break. It was too big for him, but his eyes lit up as he turned it over in his hands. Really? For me? Yeah. Figure you earned it, being rescued by a train engineer and all. Mark cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. Got you this, too. He handed over the sandwich. Hospital food probably isn't great. Thanks, Benji said quietly, unwrapping the sandwich with careful movements. He took a small bite, then smiled. Peanut butter and banana? Hope that's okay. Wasn't sure what you liked. It's my favorite, Benji said, taking another bigger bite. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Benji eating while Mark looked around the room. There were no personal items visible besides the drawings, no photos, no toys, no books. Just the notebook and a few worn pencils. Want to come see Ghost? Mark asked finally. He's waiting outside. Mrs. Peters wouldn't let him in. Benji nodded eagerly, setting aside the remains of his sandwich. Mark helped him navigate the stairs with his crutches, moving slowly but steadily. When they reached the front door, Ghost was exactly where Mark had left him, lying patiently on the grass. The dog's tail started wagging the moment he saw Benji, but he stayed put until the boy had carefully lowered himself to sit on the front step. Only then did Ghost approach, pressing his nose gently against Benji's hand in greeting. Hey boy, Benji said softly, scratching behind Ghost's ears. He broke off a piece of his sandwich crust and held it out. Ghost took it delicately, then settled down at Benji's feet as if he'd always belonged there. Mark stood a few steps back, watching the scene unfold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, making the old house look even more tired and worn. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Peters at her desk, still working on her endless paperwork. A car drove past, kicking up fallen leaves. No one looked out to check on Benji. Mark's eyes moved from the house to the boy to the dog, taking in the quiet tableau they made. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but definite, like a gear clicking into place or a decision settling into bone. But he said nothing, just stood there as the shadows lengthened and Ghost pressed closer to Benji's side. The wipers squeaked softly against the windshield as Mark guided his truck through the quiet streets. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, head resting against the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The dog had jumped in without hesitation when Mark opened the door, as if he'd always belonged there. Streetlights cast periodic shadows across the dashboard as they drove past the busier part of town, heading toward the outskirts where the houses grew further apart and the trees more numerous. Mark's small house appeared around a bend, a modest single-story structure with weather-worn blue paint and a small covered porch. Nothing fancy, but it was his, and it was quiet. He pulled into the gravel driveway, the truck's headlights illuminating the empty carport before he cut the engine. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as they sat there for a moment, neither moving. Ghost turned to look at him, ears perked forward questioningly. "Come on then," Mark said softly, opening his door. Ghost followed, shaking off the light rain as they hurried to the porch. Inside, Mark flipped on the lights, revealing a space that was neat but sparse. The living room held a worn leather couch, a coffee table with a few water rings, and a small TV that rarely saw use. The kitchen beyond was clean, but showed little evidence of actual cooking. A coffee maker, a microwave, some basic plates and utensils. Ghost padded around the house, nose working overtime as he explored his new surroundings. Mark watched him, then began to pace, his boots making soft sounds against the hardwood floors. He passed the bathroom door, the closet, his bedroom, then stopped at the spare room. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside was mostly empty space, save for a few boxes of old paperwork and a dusty desk shoved against one wall. The window looked out over the backyard, where an ancient oak tree spread its branches wide. The room felt hollow, waiting. Mark closed the door and continued his circuit of the house. He paused at a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, mostly bills and advertisements, unopened and collecting dust. His reflection caught his eye in the window above the sink. He looked tired, but something else showed in his face, a determination that hadn't been there before. With sudden purpose, he strode to his desk in the corner of the living room and opened his laptop. The screen's glow illuminated his face as he typed, "How to adopt from foster care." Link after link appeared, each leading to more information, requirements, processes, forms to fill out. Mark clicked methodically through them all, reading carefully, taking notes on a pad beside him. He found the state's adoption website, then the local agency's contact information. His printer hummed to life as he downloaded the necessary documents. Ghost wandered over and settled at his feet as Mark sorted through the papers. Background check authorization, financial statements, home study applications, the stack grew steadily higher. But Mark didn't hesitate. His pen moved steadily across each form, filling in personal information, employment history, references. The wall clock ticked past 9 when his phone buzzed. A text from Claire. "Still up for coffee?" Late shift just ended. 20 minutes later, Mark pushed open the door of the 24-hour diner near the hospital. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the soft darkness outside, but the smell of coffee was welcoming. Claire sat in a booth near the back, still in her EMT uniform, looking tired but alert. "Thanks for meeting so late," Mark said, sliding into the seat across from her. His messenger bag landed beside him with a soft thump, papers spilling slightly from the top. "No problem. I'm still on emergency response time anyway." She gestured to the waitress for 2 coffees, then nodded toward his bag. "What's all that?" Mark hesitated, then pulled out one of the forms. Claire's eyebrows rose as she read the header. "Application for Adoption Foster Parent Certification." "You're serious about this," she said. It wasn't a question. "You think it's crazy?" Mark asked, wrapping his hands around the coffee mug the waitress set in front of him. Claire studied him for a moment. "Are you sure? It's a huge responsibility." "I wasn't," Mark replied, staring into his coffee. "Then I met a kid who's been alone longer than I've ever been." He looked up at her. "They're going to move him, Claire. 40 miles away. New school, new foster home. Everything's strange again. And for what? Because it's convenient for the system?" Claire nodded slowly. "And you think you can do better?" "I think..." Mark paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think sometimes people find each other when they need to. Like that dog finding Benji. Like Benji finding me in that tunnel. Maybe it means something." "You've changed," Claire observed, taking a sip of her coffee. "The Mark I first met would never have said something like that." "Maybe I needed to change," Mark said quietly. They talked for another hour, about the adoption process, about what to expect, about how Mark's life would transform. Claire asked tough questions, but there was support in her voice. She'd seen enough in her work to know when something felt right. Back home, the house was dark, except for a small lamp in the living room. Ghost lifted his head as Mark entered, tail thumping against the floor in greeting. Mark settled at his desk again, the dog moving to lie at his feet. The forms spread out before him like a roadmap to a different life. Mark's pen moved steadily across each page, filling in boxes, signing his name, making it real. Ghost's warmth against his legs anchored him as the night grew deeper. Finally, he reached the last page. Near the bottom was a simple box. Applicant name. Mark's handwriting was neat and clear as he filled it in. Mark Halden. Below that was another box. Child's name. He paused for just a moment, then wrote, Benjamin Arlo. The morning sun cast long shadows across the foster home's worn front steps. As Mark climbed them, manila envelope tucked under his arm. The same caseworker from yesterday, Ms. Thompson, opened the door before he could knock. Her eyebrows lifted slightly at seeing him again so soon. "Mr. Halden," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you back this quickly." The hallway smelled of cleaning supplies and old carpet. Through an open door, Mark could see kids eating breakfast at a long table, their spoons clinking against ceramic bowls. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged space. "I have the initial paperwork," Mark said, following her to a small office. "Thought I'd get started right away." Ms. Thompson settled behind her desk, gesturing for Mark to take one of the metal chairs opposite her. The office was cramped but organized, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a window that looked out onto the side yard. She accepted the envelope, pulling out the stack of forms. "This is comprehensive," she said, leafing through the pages. "But you should understand that these things take time. There are protocols, background checks, home studies. Even with everything in order, it could be months before—" "I understand," Mark interrupted quietly. "I'm not trying to rush anything. I just want to do this right." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Benji's in the common room. You can see him if you'd like. But remember what I said about managing expectations." Mark found Benji sitting cross-legged on a worn couch, his cast-covered leg propped on a pillow. The boy's face brightened when he saw Mark, and he quickly closed the sketchbook in his lap. "You came back," Benji said, surprise coloring his voice. "Said I would, didn't I?" Mark settled into a chair nearby, noticing how Benji's shoulders relaxed slightly. "What are you working on there?" Benji hesitated, then slowly opened the sketchbook. The pages were filled with pencil drawings, some rough, others surprisingly detailed for someone his age. Ghost appeared in many of them, captured in different poses, sleeping, running, sitting alert. There were trains, too, and tunnels, drawn with careful attention to shadows and perspective. "These are really good," Mark said, genuinely impressed. He turned a page to find a drawing of Ghost standing on the train tracks, his stance protective and determined. The approaching train loomed in the background, rendered in sharp, bold strokes. "That's from when he saved me," Benji explained softly. "I keep thinking about it. How he knew exactly what to do." "He's a smart dog," Mark agreed. Through the window behind them, he could see Ghost himself lying in the grass, occasionally lifting his head to watch them through the glass. His chin rested on the windowsill, as if he was trying to be part of the conversation. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Mark looking through more drawings while Benji added details to a new sketch. The sounds of other kids playing drifted in from somewhere else in the house, but the common room remained quiet. Finally, Benji spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you mean it? About wanting me to come live with you?" Mark set down the sketchbook carefully. He'd been expecting this question, but it still made his heart beat a little faster. "Only if you want to," he answered slowly, making sure each word was clear. Benji stared at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Then he shrugged, a small, uncertain movement, before nodding. "Yeah, I'd like that." Outside, Ghost's tail thumped once against the ground, his eyes moving between the two of them as if he understood exactly what was being discussed. "It might take a while," Mark explained. "There's a lot of paperwork and checks they have to do first. But I'm not going anywhere." Benji nodded again, this time with more certainty. He flipped to a fresh page in his sketchbook and began drawing something new. A small house with a porch, remarkably similar to Mark's. The morning passed quietly as they talked about simpler things. Mark's work on the trains, Benji's favorite subjects in school, Ghost's apparent ability to always know when someone needed help. The conversation flowed easier now, as if some invisible barrier had been lowered between them. When it was time to leave, Mark found Ms. Thompson waiting in the hallway. She pulled him aside, her expression serious. "Mr. Halden," she said softly, glancing toward the common room where Benji was still drawing. "I need to be clear about something. Benji's been moved before. Several times. He's used to people walking out. Don't promise what you can't finish." Mark met her gaze steadily. "I don't say things I don't mean." The drive home was quiet, with Ghost sitting in the back seat like he'd found his proper place. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, watchful and aware, as if he too understood the weight of what was beginning. The Saturday morning sun painted Mark's truck in warm golden light as he pulled up to the foster home. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, betraying the nervousness he tried to hide. Ghost sat in the back seat, his tail thumping steadily against the leather, creating a rhythm that helped calm Mark's racing thoughts. Ms. Thompson stood on the front steps with Benji, who clutched a small backpack and his ever-present sketchbook. The social worker held a clipboard, her professional demeanor intact despite the early hour. "Remember, Mr. Halden," she said as Mark approached, "this is a supervised trial visit. I'll be checking in periodically throughout the weekend. Any concerns, you have my number." Mark nodded, his attention already shifting to Benji, who hadn't moved from the steps. The boy's eyes were fixed on Ghost, who had jumped down from the truck and now sat patiently waiting. "Ready?" Mark asked softly. Benji nodded, taking careful steps with his healing leg. His cast was decorated now with a few simple drawings, mostly trains and what looked like Ghost's paw prints. He moved toward the truck, pausing to scratch behind Ghost's ears. The drive home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Mark noticed Benji watching everything through the window. The trees, the houses, the way the road curved toward the quieter part of town where Mark lived. Ghost kept close to Benji's side of the truck, his head occasionally resting on the boy's shoulder. When they pulled into the driveway, Benji's eyes widened slightly. Mark's house wasn't large, but it had character. A covered porch with a swing, flower beds that needed attention, and tall windows that caught the morning light. "This is it," Mark said, trying to see his home through new eyes. "Nothing fancy, but it's quiet here." Inside, Benji moved carefully through each room, taking everything in with the observant nature Mark had come to expect from him. The living room with its comfortable couch and old TV, the kitchen with its worn but clean countertops, the small study filled with books about trains and engineering. "Want to see your room?" Mark asked, watching as Benji traced his fingers along a shelf of model trains. The boy's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face at the words, "Your room." He nodded, following Mark down the hallway, with Ghost padding along behind them. Mark opened the door to reveal walls freshly painted in soft blue. A twin bed sat against one wall, made up with new sheets decorated with vintage train designs. But what caught Benji's attention immediately was the train set taking up one corner of the room. Nothing elaborate, but a good starter set with enough track to make interesting configurations. "I thought maybe," Mark started, suddenly uncertain. "Well, if you like trains." Benji's face lit up as he moved closer to examine the set. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. "It's yours," Mark said simply. "The whole thing." For the next hour, Mark sat on the floor with Benji, showing him how to connect the tracks and operate the controls. Ghost settled nearby, watching contentedly as Benji's initial hesitation gave way to genuine excitement. As afternoon approached, Mark headed to the kitchen to start dinner. He could hear Benji still playing with the trains, occasional sound effects drifting down the hallway. It made the house feel different, fuller somehow. "Want to help?" Mark called out, and soon Benji appeared in the kitchen doorway, Ghost right behind him. While Mark wasn't exactly a master chef, he could manage the basics. He showed Benji how to measure ingredients for pasta sauce, letting him stir carefully while the water boiled. Ghost sat between them, his head swiveling back and forth as if keeping track of them both. "I usually just get whatever they're serving," Benji said quietly, watching the sauce bubble. "Never really helped make anything before." Mark felt something tighten in his chest. "Well," he said, keeping his voice steady, "we can cook together whenever you want." After dinner, they settled on the couch. Mark had found an old documentary about the golden age of steam engines, the kind of thing he usually watched alone. But Benji seemed genuinely interested, asking questions about how the engines worked and what different whistles meant. As the black and white footage played across the screen, Mark noticed Benji gradually leaning more heavily against Ghost, who had claimed his spot between them on the couch. The dog's presence seemed to anchor them both, making the unfamiliar situation feel somehow natural. Mark allowed himself to relax just a little. The tension he usually carried in his shoulders eased as he answered Benji's questions and pointed out interesting details about the old trains. This felt right in a way he hadn't expected. Not perfect, but right. Later, after Benji had fallen asleep watching the documentary, Mark carried him to his new room. The boy barely stirred as Mark tucked him in, Ghost following to take up his position near the bed. Mark stood in the doorway for a moment watching. The soft glow of the nightlight revealed Benji's peaceful expression, so different from the guarded look he usually wore. The train set sat partially assembled in the corner, waiting for tomorrow's adventures. Ghost lifted his head briefly, acknowledging Mark's presence before settling back to his watch. Stepping outside into the cool night air, Mark looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Ghost padded out to join him, sitting close enough that Mark could feel his warm presence. "Feels different," Mark said softly, his words barely disturbing the quiet night. "Like the noise finally stopped." Ghost looked up at him with those knowing eyes. Mark reached down to scratch behind his ears, smiling slightly. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" The Sunday evening sky had turned a deep purple when Mark's truck pulled up to the foster home. The weekend had passed too quickly, filled with small moments that now felt precious. Teaching Benji how to make pancakes, watching him play with the train set for hours, seeing him slowly relax into the rhythm of their temporary family. But now reality pressed in again. Benji sat rigid in the passenger seat, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest. The lightness that had filled him during their weekend together seemed to drain away with each passing moment. Ghost, sensing the change, pressed his nose against the back of Benji's neck from his spot in the back seat. "I have to go back now, don't I?" Benji asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Just for a little while," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Remember what we talked about? There's paperwork and checks they have to do first." Benji nodded, but his shoulders remained tense. He'd heard promises before. Mark could see it in the way the boy's fingers gripped his backpack straps, in how his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the building they were approaching. Ms. Thompson waited on the front steps, clipboard in hand. She offered a professional smile as Mark helped Benji out of the truck. Ghost whined softly, pawing at the window. "Did you have a good weekend?" she asked Benji. The boy nodded but didn't elaborate. He took one last look at Ghost, then at Mark, before turning toward the steps. Each movement seemed heavy, deliberate, as if he was forcing himself to walk away. "I'll be back soon," Mark called after him. Benji paused briefly, but didn't turn around. The door closed behind him with a final sounding click. The drive home felt endless. Ghost kept looking back at the empty passenger seat, letting out occasional whines that matched the ache in Mark's chest. The house, when they finally arrived, seemed too quiet. Ghost immediately went to the front door, nose pressed against the crack beneath it, waiting. Mark didn't allow himself to dwell. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. The adoption application was already in process, but there were countless details to arrange: background checks, financial verifications, character references, home inspections. He worked methodically through his list, leaving messages, sending emails, following up on every requirement. Late into the night, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. Ghost had finally settled nearby, though his ears perked up at every sound from outside. Mark rubbed his eyes, tired but determined. The empty room down the hall seemed to call out to him, reminding him of why he couldn't stop now. The next morning, he called in a favor at work, arranging his schedule to accommodate the upcoming home inspection. Claire stopped by during her lunch break, bringing coffee and her practical perspective. "You're different," she observed, watching him organize another stack of forms. "I've never seen you move this fast on anything." Mark paused, considering her words. "I've spent too long standing still," he finally said. "Can't do that anymore. Not with this." Claire nodded, understanding. She helped him prepare for the interviews, offered herself as a reference, and promised to check on Benji when her ambulance rounds took her past the foster home. The days crawled by. Mark threw himself into preparing the house, making sure everything was perfect for the inspection. He installed better safety locks, updated the fire alarms, child-proofed cabinets that had never needed it before. Ghost followed him from room to room, as if supervising the changes. Claire kept her promise, bringing news of Benji when she could. The boy spent his days drawing, she reported, page after page of trains, of Ghost, of the weekend they'd shared. Every night, she said, he asked the staff the same question. Did anyone call yet? Each report made Mark work harder. He called the social services office daily, checking on the status of his application. He submitted extra references, provided additional documentation, anything to speed up the process. The urgency drove him, knowing that somewhere across town, a boy was waiting, counting the days, probably wondering if this time would be different. 1 week later, exactly 7 days after that Sunday evening goodbye, Mark pulled up outside the foster home again. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spotted Ms. Thompson waiting on the steps, a thick folder in her hands. Ghost, who hadn't left Mark's side all week, sat up straighter in the back seat. The social worker met him halfway down the path, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she held out the folder. "It's approved," she said simply. "He's yours, if you still want this." Before Mark could respond, movement caught his eye. Benji appeared in the doorway, backpack already slung over his shoulder. He must have been watching, waiting. The boy hurried down the steps but stopped short of the truck, uncertainty flickering across his face. "You sure?" Benji asked, his voice small but clear in the morning air. Mark felt something in his chest expand, warm and certain. He smiled, the expression feeling natural and right. "I don't say things I don't mean." The change in Benji's expression was immediate, hope breaking through like sunlight. He moved forward, reaching for the truck's door handle. Ghost greeted him with an enthusiastic lick to his hand, tail wagging furiously. The truck door shut with a solid thunk. Ghost settled between them, head resting on Benji's lap. A new chapter began. The evening sun cast long shadows across Mark's driveway as his truck pulled in, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Benji sat quietly in the passenger seat, his worn backpack clutched tightly in his lap, fingers absently tracing the frayed straps. His eyes darted from window to window of the house, taking in every detail as if afraid it might disappear. Ghost didn't wait for either of them to move. The moment Mark cut the engine, the dog leaped from the back seat through the open window, a move that made Benji laugh despite his nerves. Ghost bounded straight to the front steps, tail wagging with purpose, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment all along. "He seems pretty sure about this," Mark said, watching Ghost sit expectantly by the door. Benji nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He always knows things before anyone else does. Mark grabbed Benji's duffel bag from the truck bed, while the boy carefully climbed down, still favoring his healing leg slightly. The late summer air was warm and sweet with the scent of nearby pine trees. A train whistle echoed in the distance, familiar and comforting. Inside, Mark flicked on the lights, illuminating the living room. Even though Benji had spent the weekend here before, Mark felt compelled to give him another tour. This time was different. This time was permanent. "Kitchen's stocked better now," Mark said, opening the fridge to show shelves filled with actual groceries instead of his usual bachelor basics. "Got those cereals you mentioned liking?" Benji peered inside, eyes widening slightly at the sight of his favorite brands lined up neatly on the middle shelf. Ghost padded around them, nose twitching at the new scents. They moved through the house slowly, Mark pointing out little changes he'd made. New towels in the bathroom, a proper desk in Benji's room, extra blankets in the hallway closet. "It's all yours now," he said, watching Benji take it all in. In his room, Benji unpacked with careful deliberation. Mark leaned against the doorframe, trying not to hover but unable to look away. The boy's possessions were few, some clothes, a couple of books, his precious sketchbook. Each item was placed with thoughtful precision, as if Benji was creating a map of belonging. The sketchbook went on the nightstand first, followed by a slightly crumpled drawing of a train that Mark recognized from their weekend together. Last came a photograph of Ghost, slightly dog-eared at the corners, captured mid-bark with his ears alert. Benji adjusted these items several times, making sure they were perfectly aligned. "Pizza okay for dinner?" Mark asked, breaking the quiet moment. "Figured we could keep it simple tonight." Benji's face brightened. "Can we get the one with extra cheese?" "Whatever you want, kid." They settled into the living room while waiting for delivery. Ghost claimed his spot between them on the couch, head resting on Benji's knee. The TV hummed quietly in the background, some nature documentary about wolves that neither of them was really watching. Their conversation meandered comfortably, touching on nothing particularly important. Benji told Mark about a book he'd been reading at the foster home, something about trains crossing America. Mark shared stories about funny things that happened at work, carefully edited to make Benji laugh. The pizza arrived hot and perfect. They ate straight from the box, using paper towels as plates because Mark hadn't thought about paper plates yet. Ghost watched hopefully until Benji snuck him a piece of crust, earning a mock-stern look from Mark that dissolved into a smile. As the evening wore on, Benji's responses grew slower, his eyes heavy. He curled up under the throw blanket Mark kept on the couch. Ghost pressed against his side like a furry guardian. The dog's eyes met Mark's, seeming to say, "I've got this, watch." Mark pretended to focus on the TV, sneaking glances at the boy who was fighting so hard to stay awake. Within minutes, Benji was sound asleep, his breathing deep and even. The tension had finally left his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. With careful movements, Mark stood and gently scooped Benji up, blanket and all. The boy barely stirred, instinctively curling closer to Mark's chest. Ghost followed silently as Mark carried Benji to his room, watching intently as Mark laid him on the bed and pulled the covers up. For a moment, Mark just stood there, taking in the sight of Benji sleeping peacefully in his new room. The nightstand items caught his eye, the careful arrangement speaking volumes about what the boy valued most. Ghost nudged Mark's hand with his nose, as if saying it was okay to step away. The night air was cool when Mark stepped out onto the porch. He took a deep breath, letting his gaze drift upward to where stars were beginning to peek through the darkening sky. The distant rumble of a train drew his attention downward, to where the tracks were barely visible through the trees beyond his property. For the first time in years, Mark felt the tight knot of tension between his shoulders begin to unwind. The weight he'd carried for so long seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing it with Benji and Ghost had transformed it into something manageable. The soft click of claws on wood announced Ghost's arrival. The dog padded over to sit beside Mark, their shoulders almost touching. In the quiet moment, Mark found himself speaking softly to his four-legged companion. "You stopped a train to save a kid," he murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Ghost's ears. "And maybe me too." The evening settled around Mark's house like a warm blanket, soft and comforting in its familiarity. 2 weeks had passed since Benji had moved in, and the changes were visible everywhere. Not just in the physical space, but in the air itself. The house had transformed from a place Mark merely existed in to somewhere that felt truly lived in. Through the screen door, dishes from their dinner still sat in the sink, waiting to be washed. Benji's sneakers lay kicked off by the welcome mat, slightly muddy from his afternoon exploration of the backyard. The refrigerator door was barely visible through the kitchen window, its surface now decorated with a collage of Benji's drawings, trains, trees, and countless sketches of Ghost in various poses. Mark and Benji sat together on the worn wooden porch steps, enjoying the peaceful transition from day to evening. The late summer air hummed with cricket songs, punctuated by the occasional tweet of birds making their final rounds before sunset. Ghost sprawled in the grass nearby, contentedly gnawing on a stick he'd found, his tail sweeping lazy patterns in the grass. Benji's leg had healed enough that he no longer needed help on the stairs, though he still moved with careful deliberation. He sat with his arms wrapped around his knees, watching Ghost with that quiet intensity that Mark had come to recognize as his natural state. The boy seemed more settled now, less like he was waiting for everything to disappear. The evening light caught in Benji's hair, making the usually dark strands look almost golden. He'd gotten a proper haircut last week, his first since moving in, and the shorter style made him look more like the 10-year-old he was, rather than the older, more guarded child Mark had first met in the tunnel. "How long does it take?" Benji asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Mark turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "How long does what take?" "To learn how to drive a train," Benji clarified, his eyes still fixed on Ghost. "Like really drive one, not just knowing which buttons to push." Mark shifted, settling into what Benji had dubbed his teaching position. Slightly turned, one arm resting on his knee, he started to explain about the training programs, the certifications required, the hours of supervised runs needed before being cleared for solo operation. But something in Benji's expression made him pause mid-sentence. The boy wasn't asking about mechanics or regulations. There was something deeper in his question, something that reminded Mark of late-night conversations with his own father years ago. Questions that seemed simple on the surface, but carried the weight of much bigger wonderings underneath. Mark fell quiet, watching Ghost abandon his stick to investigate something in the flower bed that Claire had helped them plant last weekend. The dog's ears perked forward with interest, then relaxed as whatever had caught his attention proved unremarkable. Benji didn't push for an answer. He just sat there, patient and thoughtful, his chin now resting on his knees. The position made him look smaller, more vulnerable, but not in the way he'd appeared in the foster home. This was different. This was trust. After a while, Benji spoke again, his voice soft but clear in the evening air. "Why do you think Ghost stopped your train that day?" The question hung between them, important in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Mark could feel Benji watching him now, waiting to see how he'd answer. Ghost, as if sensing he was the topic of conversation, lifted his head and looked at them both with those intelligent eyes. Mark considered his words carefully. He thought about that day, the rain, the tunnel, the sound of Benji's voice echoing up from the shaft. He thought about Ghost standing on those tracks, refusing to move, leading him exactly where he needed to be. Because, Mark said finally, he knew I was the only one who'd hear him. The words settled into the warm air like truth. Benji smiled slightly, a small but genuine expression that reached his eyes. He nodded once, as if Mark had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Ghost chose that moment to abandon his exploration of the flower bed. He climbed the porch steps with deliberate grace, his nails clicking softly on the wood. Without hesitation, he settled himself beside them, pressing his warm bulk against their legs as if to anchor them all together. Mark found himself lifting his arm, letting it rest gently across Benji's shoulders. The boy didn't flinch or pull away, another small victory in their growing trust. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, accepting the comfort offered. They sat like that as the sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. No grand speeches were needed, no declarations or promises. Just this quiet moment of belonging, as natural as breathing. The last rays of sunlight caught the edge of the woods where the old tracks disappeared between the trees. From here, they could just make out the rusted rails that once led to the tunnel, now sealed with concrete and warning signs. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was here, on these porch steps, in this moment of perfect understanding. Ghost sighed contentedly, his head heavy against Benji's knee. A train whistle sounded in the distance. Not Mark's train, not today. And Benji's hand automatically found Ghost's fur, fingers curling into the thick ruff around his neck. Mark's arm stayed steady around the boy's shoulders, solid and sure. The birds made their final calls as dusk settled in. Through the screen door, the house waited warmly. Dishes to be washed, drawings to be hung, tomorrow's lunches to be packed. All the small, ordinary pieces of a life being built together, one quiet evening at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Mark and Ghost, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.